It was a faith healing cult. They believed that any sort of illness or, whether it's mental or physical, that it could be healed through praying to God and having enough faith. If you prayed to God and you were not healed, that was your fault for not having enough faith. They completely prohibited using medicine or receiving medical care. They believed that medicine originated out of witchcraft, that it was demonic, and that doctors and hospitals were also demonic entities. They believed that doctors deprived men of their right to touch their wives' and children's bodies. As far as mental health issues go, when somebody had mental health issues, they tried to heal that by doing exorcisms. They would lay hands on the person and try to cast out the evil demons that were causing those mental problems.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Truth That Heals podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anthony Hernandez, and today I have a special guest, and I'm here with Jennifer Schooley. Jennifer, thank you so much for being here on the Truth That Heals podcast.
You're welcome, Ryan. It's a pleasure to talk with you today.
Now, before we get started, can you share where you are in the country?
Absolutely. I am in hot and sunny San Antonio, Texas. It feels like a hot summer day today, even though it's the end of October. And I'm pretty used to this. I've lived in San Antonio longer than anywhere else.
Okay, I'm so happy to have a fellow San Antonioan person here. I'm also in San Antonio. And if you're watching the video, those in the audience, if you're watching this on Spotify video or on YouTube, you might notice that I'm sweating. Yes, I'm sweating. That's because I am in San Antonio and there's no air conditioning. So I have my fans running. But yes, it is very hot, but it's always exciting to have someone from the same city. So thank you so much for being here on the podcast.
You're welcome. And thanks for extending an invitation to me. I'm honored to be able to talk with you and all of the listeners today.
So I connected with you through Instagram, but I've also seen that you were highlighted or featured in, I believe it was I Got Out. Is that the correct one? It was I Got Out in 2021.
Yes, that's right. I did a writing workshop with them as part of my healing journey. And through that, I submitted a short personal essay that I allowed for them to publish on their website. If you're interested in reading that, you can find it on their website, which I believe it's igotout.org, or on their Instagram profile. They featured me, although that was a few years ago.
So for those who may not know, what is igotout.org? What is it all about?
What I know about it is that it started as a response to the troubles around the NXIVM cult that happened maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, that came to light and was publicized. Around that time, some of the people decided to found this organization to raise awareness about cult coercive control and to provide a resource for people who are healing from cult abuse.
So being on the igotout.org and sharing a bit of your story or being part of the workshop, what was it that you wrote about?
I wrote about my personal experience growing up in a Christian faith healing cult. We were not allowed to identify the name of the cult for the organization. However, I am open and willing to identify it publicly at this time. The name of the cult was Faith Assembly, and there are several churches and religious organizations that use that name, but there was a particular cult by the name of Faith Assembly that was under the leadership of a man named Hobart Freeman. And this is the cult that I was raised in.
Okay, so now I want to kind of explore the world of cults with you. Can you share a bit about why did you why can you say it's a cult? Like, what proof do you have it's a cult? Because there are people who say maybe it's just a religious group, but
Mhm.
but how do you come to the conclusion that it's a cult?
There are plenty of people who still believe Faith Assembly is just a Christian religious group, that it's a church organization. And I believe that both of my parents are of that belief currently. Lots of people who were involved with this group do not see it as a cult. And to be honest, I did not realize it was a cult until 4 years ago, 2020. Even though I grew up in it, I had no idea that it was a cult. I found out because of information on the internet, actually. It is identified as a cult on resources that I'll, if you want me to send you a list of resources, I can check for them later. I don't know what they are off the top of my head, but there are resources that I found on the internet when I was doing research that did identify Faith Assembly as a legitimate cult.
And looking back, can you share with us how did your journey with this faith-based movement begin?
It began it began before I was born. It began with my mother. In the late 1960s, my mother was a teenager, about 13 years old, I believe, and her neighbors invited her to a prayer meeting at their house. She attended and felt very comfortable there. She said she felt loved. She was told about Jesus's love for her, and that was something that she needed in her life. And from that time on, she was sold to that cult. She has been faithful to that group ever since she was about 13 years old. When I was born, my mother was still very active in this group, and her beliefs impacted my childbirth and my infancy, as well as my entire childhood until the age of 18, when I was able to leave home.
So during those years that you grew up in this faith-based cult movement, were there any red flags during your time there that you were able to recognize, or were the red flags only seen after you turned 18?
That's a great question. I think as a child, because of the isolation that was enforced on me, I did not have an awareness of how abnormal my life was. I knew it wasn't as normal as other people I went to school with, but I really didn't get a chance to spend time with friends from school, go to their homes, and see how other people lived their lives. So I really had no idea that there was anything wrong with it. At least logically, I didn't identify that. In my soul, I always knew there was something wrong with the way that I was being raised. It did not feel right to me. I had an innate sense that I should not be living my life in that way.
So you couldn't spend time with your schoolmates. You knew that something was different. For those who may have never been in a cult, they may not totally understand this. So can you kind of shed light on what was the lifestyle like? What were the routines? What were the habits in the daily life being part of this cult?
So I would say most importantly in this cult was the separation between the in-group, the people who were part of the group, and all of the outsiders. or as they refer to it, the secular world. And this included other Christians and other religious organizations. If you were not part of this particular faith group, then they thought that everybody else was wrong and should be avoided at all costs. There's a verse in the Bible that says, do not be unequally yoked, which I think is talks to the idea that you should not associate or connect yourself with people who are not of the same faith as you. And this was very, very important in the cult. This was a way to prohibit people from developing normal relationships with normal people outside of the cult and increasing the isolation.
When you say isolation, can you kind of walk us through what was that like growing up? And then when you were able to come out of that, I guess you could say, bondage?
Sure. So the isolation was, in a sense, physical and social, in that I was not allowed to spend time with most people unless they were vetted by my parents very closely and were not considered a threat to our beliefs or my parents' beliefs. Additionally, though, we were also isolated from media. I was not allowed to watch most movies. I was not allowed to watch most television. We never really had the news at my house. We didn't get a newspaper. I wasn't allowed to read magazines. There were some books that I wanted to read, and I wasn't allowed to read those books. So everything was very controlled. It wasn't just an isolation from other people. It was isolation from ideas from the outside world.
And why do you think that they were trying to do this, especially with the kids, to isolate them?
Well, it's part of coercive control. This is one way to keep a person ignorant and keep them under your control.
And so your mother, she wasn't born into it, right? It was more later on.
Right.
It's like, I'm trying to think, for those who are born into it and they stay, how are they able to educate their kids? Like, what is the vision that they have for families?
The family vision is very patriarchal. The man, or the father or the husband, is the head of the household. And there's a master-slave relationship between the man and his wife. The woman is there to serve. The man is her master. And basically the children are also like servants or under the complete control of the father. So it's very patriarchal. What was the question again?
No, I was just trying to say, what is the vision that they have for families? Because it seems that, growing, you're so away from media, you're so taken away from education. It's like, how do they expect? I mean, is education at all important to them?
Higher education is not important at all. It is seen as something negative and something to be avoided. Most of the cult members did not have anything higher than a high school education. That includes both my mother and father. Neither of them had more than a high school education, and that was normal for most of the congregation. I was incredibly lucky that I was able to go to a public school growing up, and it's probably because my family lived in poverty and they couldn't afford to send me to a private school. But my brother, he had some intellectual disabilities. He didn't do very well in public school. And so he ended up staying at home, and my mother homeschooled him. He did not receive a good education. I'm not sure if he ever even received his GED, to be honest with you. But higher education was definitely not encouraged For me, the only reason I went to college is because in high school, we had a career counselor who came and spoke to us and encouraged us to apply for colleges, look into colleges, get financial aid. I did that all on my own. My parents had no desire for me to go to college. Their desire was for me to get married and make some man happy and become some man's property.
So the plan is for you to just get your basic education and then just have kids and that's it. Then you're a slave
Exactly.
pretty much for the rest of your life.
Yes.
And what are the roles that the husband does besides being kind of like a slave master?
He is supposed to be like almost like a mouthpiece or a medium for the Holy Spirit or for God. So he's sort of serving as like an analogy would be the pastor of a church is kind of like what the father or the husband of a family is. Mm-hmm. So he is the spiritual leader. That's his role.
So now I wanted to kind of see, because you were saying that you were setting yourself up to go to college all on your own, behind mm-hmm. your parents' back. Were you terrified about what you were doing? That you would get caught?
No. And I didn't have to hide it from them. Okay. And at this time also, my family was falling apart because my family was also incredibly toxic and dysfunctional. So at this time, my last year of high school, my parents separated. My dad moved out, so he was out of the picture. He no longer had any control over me. And that gave me a lot more freedom. And my mom was very distracted by her emotional distress. And she wasn't paying any attention to me at all. So for me, that was great. That was the first time I really had freedom in my life. Even though it was due to neglect, that gave me an opportunity to move in a direction that would improve my life.
How did you feel interiorly when you've been restricted all your life and here you are discovering freedom? How did it feel? What were your thoughts? What were your feelings at that time?
It was relief. It was just so much relief. It was everything that I had ever wanted. All I had ever wanted was just freedom to be myself and to live my life the way that I wanted to. And I finally was starting to get an opportunity to do that. So it was a huge sense of relief for me, a sense of freedom, feeling of freedom. And I can't say that I was really positive about the future. I was never able to really see a future for myself ever. It was just surviving in the moment. So at that time when I started to have a little bit more freedom, it just felt like surviving was a little bit easier for me at that time.
So during this time, you're surviving, you're finding your freedom, but also you were, for many years, for your whole life, in a cult. Can you share with us if that background, did it ever have an effect while you're trying to start this new life? How did it affect you?
It had devastating consequences on my mental health. Starting at the age of about, I would say 8 years old, I first started feeling some major depression and anxiety. I developed an obsessive compulsive disorder called trichotillomania, which is a really long word for hair pulling. It's an anxiety-related obsessive compulsive disorder that I've had ever since I was about 8 years old because of the anxiety in my life. I didn't realize it until much later, but I have suffered from PTSD ever since I was a child. The depression, the anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder. And it's been really hard with, to deal with this. What do I want to say? Basically, I've come to accept that I have a depressive disorder, an anxiety disorder, I have PTSD. Those are considered mental illness. And for a while, I was really ashamed of the idea that I had a mental illness. But now I can accept it. It is a fact. I have a mental illness, and it's not my fault. But it is something that I have to live with.
So here I see in your story that we have a little child who's growing up with PTSD, with depression, hair pulling. And on the other side, you have this group cult that is, I think you mentioned healing, or they have faith healing.
Mhm.
Were they against psychiatry, going to doctors? And since that's the case, since they weren't for it, how would they treat you with their faith healing? Like how did that look like?
So that gets into one of the major tenets of the Faith Assembly cult. It was a faith healing cult. They believed that any sort of illness or whether it's mental or physical, that it could be healed through praying to God and having enough faith. If you prayed to God and you were not healed, that was your fault for not having enough faith. They completely prohibited using medicine or receiving medical care. They believed that medicine originated out of witchcraft, that it was demonic, and that doctors and hospitals were also demonic entities. They believed that doctors deprived men of their right to touch their wives' and children's bodies. As far as mental health issues go, when somebody had mental health issues, they tried to heal that by doing exorcisms. They would lay hands on the person and try to cast out the evil demons that were causing those mental problems.
And how many times did you see these exorcisms performed?
Thank goodness I never witnessed that. This is something that I have heard about from other people who had more like firsthand on-site experience with it. I believe that my mother may have seen some of those things when she was active in the cult, but I never witnessed that personally.
Okay, so
although I did say one time, I do remember I went through a period when my family first moved to Texas, maybe because of the heat here, but I had a series of really bad headaches. And I was maybe 8 years old when this happened. I remember being in the car in the back seat. My mom was driving, and I had a horrible headache. And I said, "Mom, my head hurts really bad." And instead of giving me a Tylenol or something to help with the pain, instead she put her hands on me and she started speaking in tongues. And it's the only time in my life I ever saw my mother speaking in tongues. And as a child, I thought it was amazing. I was like, wow, my mom is speaking in other languages. She must be a genius. I thought she was like this amazing thing. But now looking back on that, I don't have children of my own, but if I did and my child had a headache, I would want to get them some medication to relieve their pain.
now for your mother speaking in tongues, looking back, do you think she was really speaking in tongues, or do you think she was faking it?
I think she might have believed she was speaking in tongues, because the brain is really good at playing tricks on people.
Or let's say, I mean, yeah, she could have believed it, but do you think she was really speaking a real language, like grammar? She was getting it all right and all that.
As a child, I thought she was. Now looking back on it, I don't think so. I think it was probably just gibberish.
Okay. And so the gibberish wasn't only the speaking in tongues. You said there's a lot of, this way of healing was hands-on, literally hands-on with the exorcisms and with other sicknesses. If someone didn't get sick, and let's say someone died, how did they approach that?
They their belief was that there was not enough faith to save that person, and people did get sick and die. There were about 100 known deaths associated with this cult, um, mostly affecting women and children during childbirth, but also some older people like diabetics, people with cancer who were not getting treatment. Lots of deaths that could have been easily preventable, but people died because of the medical neglect.
So, is there ever a time where you are permitted to go get medical help? Like, let's say a car accident, broken bones. Can you go to the doctor for that?
That's a good question. Growing up in my family, thank goodness we never had an experience like that to test that situation. And actually, I will say there was one time when I fractured my elbow and I had to have surgery on it when I was in middle school. At that time, my family was already a little bit distanced from the cult. They still adhered to some of the tenets and beliefs, but they were also giving in a little bit more to like outside peer pressure to what their friends in other Christian churches, told them they should do. And so they did start to heed the advice of some family friends who encouraged them to start getting us medical care.
Well, good thing they took some advice and took you for that surgery. I mean, having a broken, was it elbow?
Yeah.
Yeah, imagine not getting that taken care of. That sounds very painful. So yeah, now I wanted to ask you, what was life like outside of the cult, trying to figure out what's next in life?
It was complete chaos. I had no life skills. I was not taught to do anything on my own. I was never taught to think on my own. I was never taught any life skills. I was raised, as we mentioned before, I was raised with the anticipation that I was just going to get married, make babies, and be a servant to a man. So the only skills that I had been taught were some basic like house cleaning skills and religious studies and some cooking. So I had no life experience when I was able to go to college and I was on my own. I struggled. I actually failed out of college within 2 years, and I had always been an excellent student. But my depression was so crippling, and the chaos that I was living in was so confusing that I could not function like a normal adult.
So with college, you're having a hard time functioning. Can you share what was it like trying to function socially in society?
Socially, because I had never been allowed the opportunity to socialize very much, I now had the freedom to do so. And that was very important to me. That became the most important thing in my life, was my social life and spending time with my friends. And this is something that I think it's a normal college experience to use, alcohol, maybe some drugs, experiment with that a little bit when you're in college. And I definitely had that experience as well. And I did learn to associate socializing and having a social life with being intoxicated. And I have to say that being intoxicated and using alcohol also gave me some relief from the depression, from the bad memories that I had growing up, and it allowed me, in a way, to block out my past and move forward.
Now, did getting into alcohol, did it really help you move forward? Do you think looking back, was it helpful?
I don't think the alcohol was helpful, but definitely having friends and socializing was. A lot of the friends that I made at that time are still in my life today, and it's been decades.
Okay. And going with the alcoholism, you have mentioned, I think, before this interview that it did have a strong effect in your life. Would you like to get into that?
Sure. Um, it absolutely did have a strong effect on my life. I used it as a tool because it helped me feel better. And it was one of the only tools that I had to feel better. So I relied on it very heavily. And there were times when I didn't drink as much, and there were times when maybe my mental health wasn't so great and I would drink more. The alcohol definitely helped to relieve some of the symptoms of PTSD, even though at the time I didn't realize that I was dealing with the symptoms of PTSD. Alcohol did provide some relief, but I did not have any healthy coping mechanisms. I did not learn any healthy coping mechanisms until years later in my journey.
And what are some coping mechanisms that you did learn that you can share with us today?
What absolutely doing talk therapy has been life-changing for me. And I would say that's the number one thing, was going to a therapist. And I've gone to several different therapists throughout the years. And every single therapist that I've gone to has been helpful to me in some way and made a difference in my life. There are some other ways like meditation and mindfulness. As part of my recovery journey, when I got away from alcoholism, I got into Zen Buddhism and some of those concepts, and the concepts in Zen Buddhism about mindfulness and meditation have been very healthy and helpful for me. So meditation is very important. Spending time in nature is very important to me, very helpful. And also spending time in solitude. Even though, my social life has always been very important to me and I've treasured that, it has been very important for me to spend some time in isolation and really go within and look deep inside myself. And honestly, that's where the healing comes from, is inside. I've heard this, people say this before, and sometimes I would roll my eyes, but it's like, you have everything that you need in life. I think that's a phrase that people say, like, you already have everything that you need. And it really is true. You do. It's inside you. Everybody has that inside, but it can be hard to tap into.
So being here in San Antonio, do you have any spots that you like to go to for solitude? Because I myself, like when I need a little bit of fresh air and sunshine and maybe a little bit of silence, I'll go to Comanche Park. We have this high hill. I go by the castle over there. Or sometimes I'll go to McAllister Park, go around, walking around, enjoying the day, having some solitude, also enjoying some fresh air. How about you, being here in San Antonio? Do you have any spots?
I do. So I actually live close to the medical center area.
Okay.
And it's in the middle of a city and suburbs, but luckily San Antonio does have a lot of little natural areas tucked away. We've got some great hidden gems. One of my favorite places to go is Phil Hardberger Park. And I also like to go along the Leon Creek Greenway. There are several access points close to where I live to the Greenway. And I try to do that whenever the weather allows it. I try to get outside and spend time in nature.
Now going back to, we've already established having some time for solitude, but you mentioned also going to therapy. How is it for a former cult member who's been, I guess one can say, brainwashed to believe that all these therapists, all these doctors are witchcraft? Was it scary for you to make that call and set up that appointment to have talk therapy?
When I first went to the therapist, I was in the throes of depression. It was so bad. I was in despair. I was suicidal. I was really at the of my end of my rope, and I didn't know what else to do. I would have tried anything, really. I was just at the point where I was going to give up if I didn't get some help. So I didn't have a problem going to a therapist. Now, I've always had a phobia about getting actual physical medical attention, going to doctors, being in hospitals, doctors' offices give me a huge amount of anxiety.
And do you still have it?
Yes, I absolutely do. And even though logically I understand that there's no danger in going to get medicine or going to talk to a doctor and get medical care, I am terrified of the experience.
Well, thank you for sharing and being so vulnerable here on the podcast. Now I wanted to switch over to something else, and that is, what are you doing today with your life? How much has life changed from the day you left the cult to today?
It has changed drastically. My life has been pretty crazy. Maybe I'll write a book someday. I've had all kinds of strange, unusual experiences. So, first of all, growing up in a cult, which was something that, it was a very different way of living and growing up. And then my first job out of college was teaching English as a second language in Japan. And I spent 5 years living in Japan. And that was really life-changing for me. That showed me that there was a whole nother world within our world, basically. And it made me so grateful that I had never committed suicide, that I didn't give up, because I had the best 5 years of my entire life so far, were those years that I was in Japan. And I'm so grateful for that experience. And I feel like that was my reward for the trials and tribulations that I had endured. And now, after those 5 years were up, I moved back to the States and went to graduate school, got married, got divorced. Life has just taken me in all kinds of unexpected directions. I have tried to get a job as a librarian, but I was not able to find find paid work as a librarian. So instead I went into law. I worked in law offices for a while. I hated it, quit doing that. After that, I worked as an office manager for a while, and I've worked for a software company. Right now, I am unemployed, and I am searching again for library positions, trying to move forward. In the past, I have been very focused on trying to secure high-paying jobs because I have lived in poverty most of my life, and I'm concerned about my financial independence. I don't want to be dependent on anybody else for my finances. I want to make sure that I can take care of myself. So I've had to definitely shift my views on what I'm looking for in a career. Right now, instead of looking for the highest paying jobs, I'm looking for a job that gives me purpose and meaning in my life, and that helps people.
Go ahead, sorry.
So also, in this time period, since I am not working full time, I did start a side business selling vintage clothing. It's a hobby of mine that developed out of living in poverty, was shopping in thrift stores and wearing vintage clothing, which is something that, even though I can maybe afford to buy brand new clothing now, I don't see the point in it. I really enjoy being able to hunt through thrift stores or garage sales, estate sales, and find pieces of clothing that would otherwise be destined for the landfill and keep those in use. And then I'm not wearing the same kinds of things as everybody else. So it gives me some individuality. This has been a really nice hobby that I enjoy doing, and it makes some money on the side for me as well. So I'm really thankful to have this opportunity to do this while I'm kind of in a transitional phase and trying to sort out what my next move is.
So while you're hunting for vintage clothing, can you give us a background as to the purpose of getting into this hobby, and how is it that you find meaning by doing this?
So, so again, I got into it because I was too poor to afford brand new clothing when I was in college, and I had a friend who introduced me to thrifting. And I've loved it ever since then. For me, it's a place where I can go and kind of turn off my brain and just relax and flip through the hangers, every single piece. And there's a lot of junk out there. But when you find a really nice piece, it's like finding a needle in a haystack, but the needle is solid gold. So it feels like it's a great reward to find something like that. It gives me personal satisfaction in that way. But I feel like it makes a difference in the world also, because every piece that I find and buy to either use for myself or to resell, it saves that item from the landfill. And this is important because fashion, and especially fast fashion, has become the second largest polluting industry of the world. There are huge landfills I'm sure all over the world, but I know of some, especially in South America, that are just clothes just get dumped there. And a lot of these clothes are brand new with tags still on, just clothes that never even get sold in the stores. And they just end up being trashed. So I like to do my part by not only saving a piece from the landfill here and there where I can, but also by providing an alternative to people who do not want to buy fast fashion.
So by doing this, do you feel that you're doing maybe your part in, I don't know, saving the world, or how would you describe it?
Yeah, a little bit. I don't think that I'm single-handedly going to save the entire world from extinction or global warming or something like that. But it does give me a little sense of control over my own situation and my own environment. Instead of just sitting back and complaining about how bad things are in the world, I think it's much more valuable to take any step towards making the world a better place, no matter how small that step is. And it may not make a huge difference to the rest of the world, but it definitely makes a difference to my heart.
Thank you so much for shedding some light on that. I have never spoken to anybody on this podcast about maybe the little things that we can do to make the world a better place. And maybe it's not going to change the whole world, but you're doing your part, and it's inspiring me now, and maybe it'll inspire someone else in the audience. So so we'll see. There you
go. I hope so. I hope it'll inspire someone to, look for ways that you can do something to make your life and your environment just a little bit better. And I can guarantee you it'll make you feel happier.
And now I'd like to ask you my ultimate question, and that is, what is your truth that heals?
My truth that heals is I had to choose myself. I had to choose to get in touch with my own soul, with my own heart, with my own knowledge that I have inside. And not give up. So as I mentioned earlier, when I was growing up, I had an innate sense that the way I was being raised was incorrect, that it was wrong. I knew I wasn't meant to live that way. And I never gave up on that, even though my parents and the other people in the cult might have tried to really drill that out of me and to destroy that part of me. I never gave up on it. I had to get quiet about it sometimes and just keep it inside and kind of bury it for a while to keep it safe. But I never let anybody else kill it or take it away completely. Honestly, I don't know if people can take that away from somebody. I think it's always there. And the truth is, when you learn how to tap into that and access your true self, then you're going to begin your healing journey.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for sharing your Truth That Heals. And where can people in the audience find out more stuff about you and also check out your projects with the whole vintage clothing business?
Sure. So my vintage clothing business is called Cosmic Country Vintage. I'm on the Etsy platform, so you can search for me there if you're interested in shopping vintage. And I'm not the only vintage seller there. There's tons of great vintage options on the entire platform. But you can also find an account for my personal account and my business account on Instagram. You can find me on TikTok and on Facebook.
Okay, and I'll make sure to leave those links in the description, in the show notes. Again, Jennifer, thank you so much for being a guest here on the podcast. And for those who are tuning in to the Truth That Heals podcast, whether it's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, or wherever it is, it could be Facebook, go ahead and follow, give a subscription, and please rate this episode and share it with others so that they can discover the truth that heals. Have a great day.